I do love that you clap before I speak. It's definitely the best bit, because now I feel validated and I haven't even told you what's going to happen. Normally at this point, I would take a photo to prove to my children that people turned up to my talk. But I've seen the code of conduct and I saw the picture, so I will not be doing that today because clearly I see all the faces. So make sure you're looking at me and not looking at your phones because I can see you. This talk is for Sunshine PHP. This is definitely one of those cases where I'm taking advantage of the fact that I can speak at this user group, get some feedback before I take it to a conference where a load of Americans will get to see it. I would love some feedback on what you found useful, what you didn't find useful, which bits made no sense, which bits were boring in particular. Let me know because that would be really helpful, thanks. With that, we're going to talk about static analysis and strict typing. So, lovely little quote from Anthony Ferrara. Use types to help focus on what you're doing, not how you're doing it. And this kind of emphasizes to me why I'm interested in types and strict typing in particular within a language, which I find quite ironic because I started in C++, which is a very strictly typed language, and went to PHP 3, which could not be called a strictly typed language under any sense of the word. And it's got better over time and now works far nicer. Talk about types. What do we mean by types? We mean these. You've all seen this before. Booleans, floats, integers, arrays, things like that are all types in PHP. This is the entire list. That's all the types that PHP supports. The magic one here called object covers all your classes and all their specific ones. But from PHP's point of view, it's just an object underneath the hood. All languages are typed in some form or another. Well, all languages that you are likely to program in mainstream are typed in some form or another. Dynamically typed languages are like PHP, Python, Ruby, things like that. Strict type, statically typed languages like C++, Go, Rust, etc. What makes PHP dynamically typed is something called type juggling. So this is what I mean by type juggling. Given a particular type, and you've got two variables, two things that need to be together, PHP will juggle from one type to another in hopefully the right way. So this is the obvious example. We have a string, 2 plus 3 equals, and we want to concatenate to the end of the string numeric 5, an integer. An integer is not a string, concatenation does not work. To make this work, PHP will magically turn that integer into a string for us, and then concatenation will work. And we get our string 2 plus 3 equals 5. Similarly, we can take a string and we can add it to an integer. You clearly cannot sum a string to an integer. That makes no sense. So PHP will turn the string into a number, and now you can do your addition. And again, we'll get an integer of 15. This is fantastic. This is when it all works perfectly well, the way it's supposed to work, and the computer has done things for us that saved us effort. And that is the #1 reason why I got into PHP for web programming. Compared to writing C binaries for doing the web, this was a breath of fresh air. It was so much easier. However, computers, don't you just love them? Let's suppose that one of your users types in 10,000 for you. So now you want to add 10 to your 10,000, and PHP is going to do its type juggling. Computers are smart, aren't they? We get 20. We do not get 10,010 because PHP will stop processing the type juggling at the first character in a string it doesn't understand, which causes all manner of problems for strings that look vaguely hexadecimal but not quite. Similarly, a result is false. This normally happens, string false, when you've pulled it out of an XML array, XML document or something like that. It becomes a string. I know you've never heard of XML because you're all young. People like me, I work in enterprise, we see XML a lot. If result is going to answer true, because false is true in this scenario. Well, string false is Boolean true. Type juggling has failed us. This causes lots of errors in your code that most of the time you do not see, because you would never type the wrong thing in and make it not work. Don't tell me you would. Nobody does. Nobody tests the edge cases properly. You can't trust a computer. So we get around this. What do? We all test everything, don't we? We all have perfect 100% coverage, and in addition, we test every possible combination that might possibly happen related to type juggling. No one does this. Some of you might think you do, but you don't. Nobody can be bothered. Practically, it does not happen. You're probably going to do some validation. This is the way that you should be handling this. If you know that we've got this function called foo, it takes an integer and it takes a boolean, test for it in your source code. Put an assertion in of some form or another and write your tests. You now have to write additional tests, because even those 6 lines of very simple code took me more than one attempt to write. So there's a lot of extra code involved. Type systems, and statically typed systems in particular, can solve this class of errors. It's not going to solve every error. It's not going to make your code magically bug-free. Anyone tells you that statically typed language like Go will make your code bug-free clearly has not written any Go, or Rust, or C, or Java, or whatever. It's all the same. Just with this particular class. So a guy called Brent at Stitcher.io wrote this. If we filter input by type, you can think of it as a subcategory of all available input. Many tests become obsolete. So one of the nice things about ensuring that your code is more statically typed, more strictly typed, is that you are reducing the amount of tests you have to write, because the engine can find them for you, or the compiler can find them for you. We do this through function type declarations. Now you've probably come across these because it's been around since PHP 7. PHP 5 for classes, PHP 7 for everything else. We can simply pass in the property int and the type boolean, and we've now specified and can guarantee at the engine level that I will always be an integer, B will always be a boolean, and this function will always return a string. I can look at this and I'm 100% sure of that. So within this function, I can trust what's coming on in terms of the types. What I do with it is my own bugs. This makes a function much easier to reason about. I care about this a lot because I work with long-lived code. Like my main project I work on day in, day out, that's actively being used, very profitable, very important to my client, was started in 2012 with PHP 5.5. It's going in 2020. It will be continuing to go, assuming I can keep the contract, for at least another 5 years. Hopefully, we shall see. With code this long and code this big, there are whole chunks of it that I do not look at from 1 year to the next. And then I go back and look at it and I have to fix a bug in that bit of code, or I need to extend it, do some maintenance to it. Being able to reason about that code and what it does, I have to rely on 2 things. What the code itself says and what the comments next to that code says. Anything that makes it easier for me to read that code is beneficial. It is much easier to reason about this function when you know the types coming into it and what it returns, as you're tracing through code that is not that familiar to you. This is obviously why we invented DocBlocks, because PHP did not do this and we needed the ability to understand our code. PHP is dynamically typed. PHP type juggles. When we introduced function type declarations, we enabled type juggling to continue. And we call that coercion. So it sounds a little bit like bashing something. It sounds a bit strict. PHP will type juggle for you if it can, under normal circumstances. So I have said that $A will always be an integer. It is only always an integer within this function. Outside of this function, it's being passed in as a string, and PHP will automatically do its type juggle and make it an integer for me. That's quite helpful, assuming you want it to do that. We've already seen why this is not necessarily a good idea, and we might not want it to happen. So we have the concept of strictly typed declarations, where we stop PHP doing the type juggling. So you can now tell PHP, don't make your best guess. Tell me if I've screwed up. This is a good thing. Declare strict types equals 1, and you now have strictly typed variable declarations. Probably all come across this before, reasonably likely. Key thing about strict types equals 1 is you must do it in the file that you are calling the function from, not the file where the function is declared. That is really, really important to get right. And it was really clever that the PHP people did it that way, because it enabled library developers to make their code strictly typed, but allow the users of that library to stop doing type coercion when they were ready to. But you must put this where you do the call, not where you do the declare. All of this is to reduce cognitive load, and I think this is really, really helpful, and in general you will thank yourself if you help your future person. We all know that the most stupid person writing this source code is past us. The whole point is to make our lives now, our future selves, life easier now. And this is what we're doing here. If you're in a team, this is doubly important, because you might think that you're stupid, but your co-worker, what was he like 6 months ago? PHP 7.4 extended the type declaration system. Hands up if you've got PHP 7.4 in production. Good. It's only just, you have? Wow, that's very impressive. You have far better tests than I do, clearly. Oh dear. It's been out a month and a half, something like that, 2 months maybe tops. PHP 7.4, get it into production, get it into your code base fairly soon, in my opinion, because I think this is a lovely new feature. We can now declare the type of properties on our classes. There are some other features in PHP 7.4. Don't know what they are, couldn't care less. This is the only one I care about. I can do public int age. My age is now guaranteed to be an integer throughout the use of this property within this class. That's pretty awesome. Again, we are removing a whole class of bugs that we had before. What happens if you try to read a property that has a declaration of an int and you didn't set a default? Because clearly I can't set a default age for this person. This person does not have a default age. 21 maybe. 42? Who knows? So what do you think is going to happen when I do that? Fatal error. You may not read from a typed property of a class until you have set its type. So don't do that. You won't do it more than once at least. So have to define it first. You can define it as a default. You can define it in your constructor. You can define it later. You can define it whenever you like, assign it, but do not read through it until you have assigned it. As you might guess, PHP is remarkably consistent when it wants to be. And this is one of those cases where it wants to be. So coercion works exactly the same way as it does for type juggling, as it does for parameters to functions. I pass in a string of 93 to Liz, and it will convert it to an int for me. So Liz is getting on a bit. If you don't want that to happen, guess what? Consistency. Set your declare strict types. Now you'll get your fatal error. So this works exactly the same way and is awesome. I love this feature. I will probably get PHP 7.4 into production sooner rather than later, just so that I can start using this. You've seen these sort of class of errors before, haven't you? Fatal error this, warning that. They're all at runtime. Runtime is great, except that when an error happens at runtime, not only can it happen on your development environment, it can happen in production. We do not like errors in production. Errors in production mean support tickets, mean phone calls at the wrong time of night. Static analysis is a way to check our code before we run it. So this is a mechanism that we can start finding where we have screwed up our code, particularly related to types, before we run it and find that bug at the wrong time in the wrong place. So what's static analysis? Static analyzers simply read your code and they will print and point out errors in it. That's all they do, is give you a report. They can ensure a whole set of errors to be found for you. It will check there's no syntax errors. It will check that your classes, your methods, your functions, your variables all exist as appropriately. So try to use an unused variable, it's going to get upset. Checks that you've got arguments that are actually used in your function calls. I don't know how often you've got a function call that takes 3 parameters, but somewhere there's a call that's got 4 parameters, and you wonder what the 4th one's doing there. That sort of thing can be found. It'll check your DocBlocks make sense. There's a really, really good chance that your DocBlocks don't actually match the reality of your source code at the moment, unless you're running a static analyzer. It will check the data passed to methods are correctly typed. That is also very helpful. There are 3 static analyzers that are worth looking at in terms of type checking. You might also consider PHP-L a static analyzer. You might consider the linters like PHPCS a static analyzer. But for the purposes of what I want to talk about in terms of types, the ones we care about are fan, PHPStan, and psalm. From a practical point of view, I don't particularly care which one you use. I would like you to use one of them. Or all 3, if you're feeling particularly adventurous. So with fan. Fan was the first one that came along. These only became relevant and useful with PHP 7 because of the way the engine changed. And you've probably heard of Rasmus Ledov. He invented the language. He knows a little bit about it. Still quite heavily involved. He works for Etsy, so he wrote fan as a personal project and then threw it over the hedge to his company and made Etsy look after it. So that's how you do things when you're a very senior developer. So Etsy look after this project. They look after it really well. It's quite stable because it's been going a long while. It's a traditional static analyzer. And you'll see what I mean by that later. But what it will do is it will pass your entire source base and then it will analyze it. So you need to tell it every single file that represents your source code before it is able to make any reports on it. The obvious consequence of that is it uses a lot of memory. Requires a PHP AST extension. That is not enabled by default, so you'll need to install it. And it doesn't pass those sort of DocBlocks, which is a real nuisance. And that's related to the fact that the AST extension can't see them, and you end up needing to use asserts instead, which is a little bit of a pain, or ignore those type of warnings. Everything uses Composer nowadays, so you're going to install it by Composer. Fan requires a configuration file. It will helpfully create one for you, which is particularly useful because it's really boring to work out all the directories where your source code is. So let it find them out for you. And then you just run it with user bin fan. And as it knows it needs a lot of memory, it provides a memory limit switch. So you can set it to 2 gigabytes or 3 gigabytes or whatever you need. For my big source code, I needed 2 gigabytes. Fan uses about 1.7 gigabytes in order to analyze the source code that I maintain. Output looks something like that, which you can't read. There's an example of one of those lines. Basically, it's a big wall of text. So it gives you a line number of which line, so admin choice controller, line 109, and it gives me a flag, fan undeclared variable dim, and the variable item data was undeclared, but array fields are being added to it. So somewhere in my source code, I've started adding things to an array, and I've not told PHP that this is an array in the first place. That's what this particular error happens to mean. Whether that's a bug or not depends on your source code. It's just telling you there's a potential issue here. PHP Stan was developed by Andre Mertes. I have probably butchered his name. Fortunately, I don't think he's here. So if so, he should be here, not me. PHP Stan is really quick. It's the fastest one that I've used. It analyzes a subset of the code base, which can be really helpful. So you can just do a subset of it. The way it does that is it will auto-load classes as it needs them, as it analyzes the code you tell it to analyze. So it doesn't need the whole lot, because it will just pull in the bits it needs. So that implies two things. One, you need auto-loading for your classes. Otherwise, it's not going to work. Secondly, all the files it auto-loads had better not have a side effect. Which shouldn't be a problem for all of you people, of course, because I'm sure you write code that doesn't have side effects within your class declarations. But be aware that essentially, whenever you do an auto-load, you're going to run that PHP file. So if you've got a bit of side effects happening at the bottom somewhere, it's going to run it. And that can cause problems, in which case fan is a better choice. Another thing about PHP Stan is it supports all those framework-specific magic methods that appear to be turning up everywhere. And it's got a load of plugins that support all the various ones like Doctrines or Laravels or Symphonies or whatever. It's got the support and understanding of what the underlying framework does so that it can understand what your code is doing that is interfacing with that framework. Doesn't need a configuration file. You can put one in if you like, but it doesn't need one by default. PHP Stan analyze the directories that you want it to run. So for my particular application, all of my source code is in app, and I've got some libraries which are in lib. And then I set the level to max because I want to find all the errors, and I get this output. You still can't read it, but I will point out that we've got color this time. So slightly prettier. I think this is the difference between Rasmus, who doesn't care about such things, and Andre, who's actually trying to get traction for his tool. Error looks something like that. The one that it found. Else branch is unreachable because the ternary operator condition is always true. So somewhere I've got a question mark colon ternary operator where the second half of that will never ever execute. That's almost certainly a bug. Why would I have a ternary where the first item is always true? Almost certainly some maintenance has taken place, which means that that particular source branch, code branch, is no longer required, and I haven't removed it properly when doing the change to the source code. So there's another side effect of long-lived code. So it's spotting errors in my source code for me. Psalm's the new one on the block, developed by Vimeo. I didn't realize that Vimeo used PHP until they released this tool. I suppose none of us did, but who knows. It's very comprehensive. This one produces an awful lot of things about your source code. Very, very detailed. It can also analyze a subset of the code base, so it also does the autoload thing, so be aware of that. And it supports a whole lot of custom PHP doc tags, which can be really helpful for providing hints in your code base to how Psalm should interpret what your code means. Same thing as before, Psalm init, because it requires one of those init files, they use XML for their config files, so definitely use their auto-generator. And again, you just run Psalm, and you get an output like this. This one looks a bit more like PHP unit, and then you get color. Output looks something like that. Error, possibly null reference. So again, we've now got a string that we can grep for that's a sort of key, if you like, for the error type. Admin choice controller line 41, column 33, in fact. So we can really pinpoint where the error is. Cannot call a method group name on a possibly null value. So clearly I've got an object that might possibly be null and I'm calling a method on it. Those are definitely things you want to find before they hit production. It might not be a real bug again. It might be a scenario where you can't actually ever get that object to be null, but the source code's PHP DocBlock or maybe the type hints imply that it could be possible. So Sam is saying, ooh, not sure. Some observations are running this code base, sorry, these static analyzers over my code base. They're all good at finding type issues. If you've got type issues in your source code, it will find them for you and report them in excruciating detail. They also found different types of bugs, and what was quite interesting is that they all found different ones. So I was finding each one of them found an issue in my source code that the other two did not report, which was quite an interesting side effect of different things. Fan was particularly good at finding things like use statements, that, imports that weren't actually required for the actual source code. That came up a few times. PHP Stan was better at logic errors, like that ternary issue that the other two didn't find. And Sam was extremely picky about types. And particularly if you've tried to use a mixed type because you think better, you know better. Don't use mixed types. Mixed types are bad. Mixed types means that you're not quite sure what's going on here. And Sam really doesn't like that. So that's static analyzers. They all look quite cool. So what I thought I'd do now is talk you through some of the actual issues it found in my source code so you can see the sort of things it picked up on. So I thought that might be helpful for us all. So this is report number 1. You look at this. I've got a class ACL, extends base ACL, so this is probably a Zen framework extension. I've got a site key that's a string, clearly, some settings, and I set a config. And you think, doesn't look much wrong there, does there? Didn't like that line. That's the first line it picked up on. We've only got to line 3 in the file. Info, missing property type. Property ACL site key does not have a declared type. Consider string. So it's quite nice that it has thought and provided a bit of advice. It's probably a string because I've assigned it a string. But there's nothing to stop me changing it to an integer further down in my constructor or in another part of this class. So Sam is saying, if you want to make this a string, make it a string. Don't rely on luck. So we'll go fix it in PHP 7.4 because we're all going to go to PHP 7.4 by just writing the word string there and all is good. Problem solved. If you're not on PHP 7.4 yet, and I can't imagine why that would be the case, put in a DocBlock. And again, Sam will now know this is always a string. Easy. Report 2, further down the same file. I've got a set site key that takes a site key and assigns it to site key. You can imagine the errors we're going to get reported here. It doesn't like this line. Missing parameter types. Parameter site key has no provided type and also a missing return type. Site key does not have a return type, but it knows that we return something. So it would like you to declare what you are doing. Again, the fix is quite easy. We're just going to declare the site key a string, and we're going to return an ACL object because clearly we're returning $this. These sort of things are not particularly difficult to add to your source code, as you can imagine. So the word tedious come to mind. Quite long-winded to do stuff like this. How about a bona fide potential bug? Those are actual reasons that I ran this source code, because I know there are bugs in my code. This code here, function populate takes a void, and site key will do this get site key, and if it doesn't exist, it will set it to 1, and then it will use it. We got the error on this line, which is not where I thought the error would be. Who would have guessed it would have been on that line? It's not on this line for a reason. In this version, we don't care what type site key is until we try to use it on this line. So on this line, we now care what type site key is, and site key had better be a string. Unfortunately, if this get site key returns an empty, whatever empty might be in PHP, you're going to get it set to an integer. And SARM doesn't like that. This was quite useful to find because at some point in the past in the source code, site key was an integer. It was a int value within the database, and it is now a string in the database. So what's obviously happened is during the change from integer to string, we've gone through and done most of the work, but we clearly missed this line. I'm obviously blaming my other developer. I have not run git blame to find out because I don't want to admit it. Because that's how git blame works, isn't it? If you don't want to know, don't ask the question. Collections. Do this quite a lot. In my choice service, I call fetch choices. I've got a function called fetch choices, which returns an array. It returns an array of choice objects. Doesn't particularly matter what choice objects are for this particular discussion. They look like database rows, and they're objects within the source code. They're entities. To tell the static analyzer what types of data are within your array, you have to use a DocBlock. Because PHP doesn't have a way to natively put it here. All you can do is tell PHP, I return an array. You cannot tell PHP, I return an array of choices. Can't be done. So we have a DocBlock where we return choice and then the square brackets. And now all the static analyzers know that we're getting an array of choices back. So I did this and promptly got this error somewhere else in the source code, like you do. Error, invalid return statement. The type array 0 choice pipe null does not match the declared return type of array key choices. What this is telling me is that although I've said that it must return an array of choices, somewhere in the source body of this function, I might set a null into that array returned. I did not know that until this error came up. Had no clue that that was possible. And it turns out that SARM was completely and utterly correct that that was possible. And we were quite lucky it had never happened, because I could quite easily see once I looked at the code, oh, that condition will result in this. That condition doesn't happen very often, fortunately. But I did not know that. So that was quite interesting. You also get false positives. So this one came up. So load by key returns question mark choice. I've not talked about the question mark because I don't think you should use it, but this is a really old code base. So question mark means it returns a null or a choice object. Those are the only two choices it may be. So we call choice equals load by key. If we don't have a choice, it's come back as null, then we're going to redirect to the home. Otherwise, we're going to get an array copy of that data and do something with it. So this is probably in a controller. Pretty sure this is in a controller or an action or something like that. Redirect to home obviously sends a redirect. So this line will never ever happen if choice is null. But SARM doesn't know that. So SARM can't tell that we will never get to this line. So this is a false positive. I'm getting an error from SARM that is not true. It's that line there. Doesn't like this line. How do we fix this one? The easiest way is to use those magic SARM properties, SARM doc annotations. SARM return works exactly the same way as DocBlocks, PHP documenters return, but you can set it to never -return. So what I'm telling SARM is that this function will never ever return. So as a result, this line, we will only ever get to here if choice is true. Choice is a valid object. In addition, because I've added this, SARM will now check that I really cannot return from redirect to home. So it will check that I will exit either in this function or in a function called by this function, and all the code paths of all those if statements within this function and its children. And I have to either throw an exception or I have to exit. Otherwise I get an error. And guess what? I got an error. because there was one particular code path where redirect to home could have returned. That was interesting. Didn't know that could happen. That's a lot of things that happen with static analysis. You look at your code and go, oh, that was interesting. Didn't know that would happen. So the SAM annotations, SAM var, SAM param, and SAM return are the match analogs for the PHP documenter ones. SAM seal properties is quite a cool one. If you've got a class that uses those magic getters and setters to set an array within the class or something like that, for instance, you should declare them as properties in the class declaration so that your autocomplete works, because you all use PHP Storm probably, or VS Code or something. If you seal the properties, what you are telling SAM is that this is a closed list of properties that these magic getters and setters can cope with. And if I try to use a magic set for a property that is not on the list, you should create an error. I think that's quite a useful one if you are still using gets and sets. Arguably, you should probably stop using them, because that solves a whole other class of problems. SAM suppress is another way to get rid of a false positive or an error you do not care about. So you can suppress a particular SAM issue in a particular position in your source code because you know that that is a false positive. All of the static analyzers have something similar to this to suppress false positives, because you will get them. Because in theory, you can reason about your source code better than the compiler, the analyzer. Not totally sure about that, but at least that's the theory. So to apply static analysis to your project, add it to your CI. It's a waste of time doing any of this if it's not in your CI, because it will entropy overnight. Anyone who has unit test-led project and doesn't add it to CI, those unit tests are rubbish within a week and are completely and utterly useless within a month and need to be deleted within 2 months. Because nobody maintains that code. The only way code is maintained is if you're not allowed to merge it to master. And the way that you don't get it merged to master is because the CI failed. The other benefit of putting it into CI is that a computer tells your colleague that they messed up rather than you, which is so much better for inter-office relationships. People are far more forgiving of computers telling them they made mistakes than people. Don't know if you've noticed this. So put it in your CI. You put it in your CI, you can use that level feature that the static analyzers have to do the easy stuff first. So set the level all the way down to the minimum level and fix all those bugs, all those reported issues. Increase the level, repeat. Eventually, you'll have solved all the possible reports in your source base. SAM found 1,745 errors and 3,229 other issues in my source base. Yes, I'm a great programmer. This project makes money. This project is profitable. This project, as far as my client is concerned, works as it's intended. We'll not talk too much to them about this. Clearly, I cannot fix getting on for 5-ish thousand issues overnight. I've got a day job. I've got better things to do in my life. I'd like to eat. Baselines enable you to set a line in the sand and start ensuring new code doesn't have new issues. So this is how you get it into your CI system, because clearly you can't get into the CI system if it is going to fail on every single PR. You log the current errors to a baseline file. With SAM, you use --set baseline and give it a file name, and then that gets added to your config file. PHP Stan has a similar functionality. Now I can run SAM as often as I like, and those errors are just treated as warnings and will not fail my CI. So as I do a new PR, if I create an issue in that new PR, I will have one error to fix. I can fix one error in one PR. That's easy. Now, I can start fixing all those warnings. I can do it over time. Whenever I touch a particular piece of source code, I can fix the warnings related to that source code whilst I'm fixing other things in that area. Maybe I can set aside Fridays and do a whole swathe of them. Once I've done that, I can update my baseline file to remove the ignoring of those particular reports because they are now solved. And over time, I will end up with a source code that is not producing errors. Okay, so that's how you integrate it into your source code. So that's all I want to talk about today. I think that's enough, and I think you probably all want another drink by now. I don't blame you. Some takeaways to think about. PHP's type declarations reduce your cognitive load. In general, a lot of your thinking about how you write source code should be about reducing cognitive load for future you. That's what we do as developers. If we didn't want to reduce cognitive load, we'd write an assembly language or something silly like that. PHP 7.4's type properties are wonderful. I think they are really useful. Upgrade to PHP 7.4. If you're below PHP 7.2, you should certainly be upgrading to PHP 7.2 or 7.3. Static analysis will find bugs in your code. If it is a non-trivial piece of software and you've not run static analysis on it before, it will find errors that you did not know were there, unless it is trivial. And it's quite scary when that happens, because you think you're a good programmer, don't you? Auto-fixers solve a lot of those grunt work ones. So you know that one where I had to add a string to a parameter and add a return type? That's pretty boring. We've got tools that can do that for us. So Salter comes with the Sun project, and Rector we had a talk about here a few months ago. Maybe a little bit more than a few months ago now. Time is very woolly after Christmas. Those tools can solve a lot of these simple cases for you, so they're worth running and seeing what happens. You can't trust computers. So once you've run them, you check what it's done. And secondly, or lastly, make sure you add this stuff to your CI system. There's no point in going through and fixing a whole load of problems with your that reported by a static analyzer and then not put it in your CI system because it will entropy it back again. And with that, I'm done. Thank you very much.